Returnal on PC is for the most part good. Well, not perfect, but at least better than a number of Unreal Engine 4 titles I've had to cover for Digital Foundry. It could be better at launch, as it currently has some key issues that you need to be made aware of if you want to play this game at launch, or instead wait for a patch down the line. So in today's video, I will go over Returnal on PC, what it does right, what it does above and beyond the PlayStation 5 version, what optimized settings are, and some commentary about the things it does not do right. But first, let's hop right into that settings menu. But hold up there, partner. You can't go into the settings menu right away in Returnal. First, you have this first boot sequence, like the PlayStation 5 game, but it's designed around PC interfaces and needs now. It's really important to see here that there is shader pre-compilation on PC, but as soon as you see it, it's basically over. I measured it taking just around 6 seconds to finish on a Core i9-12900K and around 35 seconds on a Ryzen 5 3600, although it did kind of freeze up a little bit there. And as far as I can tell, from the first few hours of the game, there does not seem to be incessant shader compilation stutter in Returnal on PC. That does not mean there isn't stutter in total, but at least in the first few hours, I do not think shader compilation stutter is the thing we are seeing here. Or at least for the game experience, excluding ray tracing, but more about that towards the end of the video when I talk about the stutter struggle. When I first started playing the game, one thing that did reassure me that there perhaps wasn't shader compilation-based stutter struggle in this game was the benchmark. You can run the benchmark when setting up your settings in the pre-launch sequence for the first time or at any time in the game itself, and the benchmark is really great as you're seeing here. It is not a gameplay representative benchmark in the fact that it is not gameplay, but the GPU utilization seen here and the amount of objects on screen rivals the game's most challenging areas. I think on the GPU side of things, it may actually be a bit heavier in its most intense moments than the average gameplay scenario. Generally though, it is very well done, and I recommend you judge your GPU performance with this benchmark. One of my favorite aspects is how it has sections that test different types of effects so you can get a sense of what your settings are going to do. And importantly, there's no shader compilation stutter evident in it when you run it the first time, which cannot be said of other games out there. The after action report for the benchmark deserves further praise as well. Much like Gears 5, you have a complete understanding of where the bottlenecks on your PC are after running this benchmark due to the information that it gives you. It tells you where and when your CPU or GPU were the limiting factor, based upon which section of the benchmark you were in. So bravo on this aspect. Another aspect of praise are in the settings themselves and how they are presented. Returnal on PC uses my favorite type of graphics menu system where the background fades out and the real game world renders behind the graphical options. It's just genius, and I really love this. On top of this, in the left-hand corner, the game tells you GPU and CPU utilization, the temperature of your GPU, its clock rate, and even the amount of VRAM that perfectly lines up with those found in programs like RTSS or CapFrameX. This is some next-level shit. The cherry on top is that each setting shows an optional preview text and image, which describes the various subcomponents of your PC and how they're affected by the setting: CPU, GPU, and VRAM. To quote the immortal Chad Warden, ballin'. The options themselves are very usable and scalable, but I'll talk about that more when I go into optimized settings later in this video. There are two things I want to briefly call out though. One is that screen optimizations contain image scaling technology. An older version of DLSS, NIS, FSR 1.0, a res scaler, dynamic resolution, XeSS if you plug in an Intel GPU, and even variable rate shading. I appreciate this, but I would have liked to have seen FSR 2, so I brought this up to the developers, and they assured to me that FSR 2 is going to be coming in the future along with DLSS 3. Another thing to mention is that the in-game res scaler currently uses a spatial upscaler. You can edit the engine.ini with these lines. You can find on the PC Gaming Wiki to change it to a TAAU style upscaler should you so wish. The third thing to call out is ultra-wide support, which generally works very well for 21:9. Gameplay shows an extended FOV on the left and right, not found in 16:9, and it feels great to play, and in-game cinematics are covered in a perfect manner. For those aspects that are not authored for ultra-wide, like pre-rendered cutscenes or certain menus, you can change how it's handled with in-game options. For example, making those 16:9 pre-rendered videos have blurred backgrounds instead of black bars like we're seeing here. This is some praiseworthy stuff, but it does fall short in one aspect, and that is for non-21:9 ultrawide monitors. The screenshot we're seeing here is from a 21:10 monitor used by John Linneman. As you can see in the screenshot, the HUD maps perfectly to the 21:10 real estate, but the gameplay is bracketed off with small black bars. So the HUD occupies the 21:10 space, but the gameplay does not. I've never seen this behavior before, but it's important to show that really only 21:9 is supported for ultrawide. So how does PC improve on PS5? In a lot of ways actually, but the biggest, most easily noticeable is in image quality. The game on PS5 runs internally at 1080p, then it upscales temporally to 1440p according to the developers, and then apparently checkerboards beyond that to 4K output. It's a bit weird, but it looks nothing like 4K in the end and leaves a lot to be desired. Put next to a standard 1080p upscale on the left and a 1080p to 4K TAAU upscale on the far right, it's easy to see how the PS5 beats a standard upscale to 4K, but is even less detailed than the 1080p temporally upscaled to 4K. Comparing the PS5 version to something like DLSS quality mode at 4K, the game looks worlds apart on PC. So much more detailed, stable, with less aliasing and ghosting even, and just a clearer image. Really, I don't even need to put too much into words here. The side-by-side show it all. Textures are given a new lease on life here where they were flickery and blocky before. The game's grass and vegetation no longer smears and looks kind of dodgy. And importantly, since there's no TAAU involved here, things like depth of field actually render correctly. See, TAAU in Unreal Engine 4 breaks its depth of field, so it disappears when TAAU is on. With DLSS or native resolution, this does not happen. So we can finally see those in-game cinematics with the proper depth of field that they were originally designed to have, but just was not present in the PlayStation 5 version. And it's not just 4K native or 4K DLSS that looks better. Heck, even 1440p DLSS and something like balanced mode looks better to my eye than the initial image quality presented in that PlayStation 5 version. I definitely think many people playing the game on PC now, after having perhaps played it on PlayStation 5, will notice this image quality difference immediately. Another thing veterans may notice is different is the game looks more contrasty at default settings like we're seeing here. There are two reasons for this. One is that the PlayStation 5 tone maps SDR content in a custom way. So games presented on PS5 always look different than Xbox or PC in SDR. But the second reason is because PC now starts with higher contrasts, making the game's darker regions look less gray and more black. This is controllable with a slider in the game menu where it starts at 50, being a bit punchier than the PlayStation 5, and 0 being more like the PlayStation 5. For the shots in this video comparing PS5 to PC, I have adjusted the contrast in post to make it most similar to the PlayStation 5 for demonstration purposes. Beyond this, the other upgrades depend more what is on screen. Some of the largest ones happen with the game's new ray tracing, first starting off with ray traced reflections. This primarily changes how water is handled like we see here. On PlayStation 5, water tends to be perfectly transparent with some very light SSR at certain grazing angles. Ray tracing enhances that by adding full reflections like we see here regardless of the angle, and I generally think the game looks better with it on. It does look different though. For example here, we can see how much the water has a different look. Less translucent, but with more perspective correct reflections. I generally like it, but this is Unreal Engine 4's RT reflections here, so they are imperfect. Sometimes the lighting of the things in the reflections does not perfectly align with the primary view rendering, but it's usually a good plus to the visuals. After this, the game also has RT shadows, which we can see here. They changed the moon shadows in the game to be done with RT. As we can see, there's no shadow map artifacting or aliasing or shadow map cascades like we see on the PlayStation 5 for this lighting, and we also get realistic attenuation on PC with RT shadows on. Celine's shadow is sharp, but the obelisk's shadow adjacent to her is soft because it is further away from the obelisk casting it. I like this upgrade a bit when it shows up on screen, but it is more limited and imperfect. Most of the lighting in the game doesn't actually come from something like the moon. Rather, they're hand-placed lights that are supposed to look like lighting coming from the moon, so they won't see any benefit from the RT. Secondly, this is once again the base shadow implementation in Unreal Engine, which is imperfect. So things like vegetation movement are not accounted for in the RT shadows as we see here. Tree branches are not swinging above with RT shadows on PC. This is only fixed in the NVIDIA branches of Unreal Engine 4. I think this upgrade is a mixed bag in its current implementation. The other most noticeable upgrade is in PC volumetrics. As we can see here, the resolution of the beams of light cast through the fog are much higher resolution on PC, with a lot less blocking out and artifacting like we see on PlayStation 5. This tends to greatly enhance the experience when running through the game world. It also affects the resolution of other volumetric effects in the game, as we can see here, right before we get the alien carbine. Other upgrades to visuals, though, are smaller, and I'd like to cover them in my optimized settings, which are designed around optimal GPU settings for a lower-end GPU, here represented by an RTX 2060 Super. Let us first start with the ray tracing settings. Ray trace reflections being turned on negatively impacts performance by around 15% in a scene like this one, but dramatically changes the visual quality even at low. Going up from low to medium increases the world quality in those reflections. Going up from medium to high increases the roughness cutoff a tiny bit. And then going up to epic sees a dramatic increase in resolution of those reflections and a small roughness cutoff difference again. I like this feature visually, and it is surprisingly cheap on the GPU, but I still recommend to turn it off to keep performance as fluid as possible in this game for optimized settings. As we'll show later in the video, it may have an effect on frame time consistency. With ray trace shadows, I have similar recommendations. Going from low to medium can have a minor effect to performance at times, while making it so that static shadows are done with RT, yet more dynamic shadows, like from the character, are still done with shadow maps. High RT shadows in Epic make it so that all moon shadows or sun shadows are done via the more accurate ray tracing. In the end, this can even have scenes where RT shadows run a little bit better than Epic shadow maps in my measurements, but I still do not recommend this for optimized settings due to the issue with vegetation that I showed off earlier, and because it can have an effect on frame times, as I will discuss later. After this, one of the biggest wins for performance is in volumetric fog. Here, going down from ultra to high sees a visible change in the volumetric lighting quality, but the performance uptick is hard to ignore. I recommend high for optimized settings here, and PlayStation 5 here seems to think the same way, where the aliasing and chunkiness of its volumetric lighting line up with the high settings to my eye, when the internal resolution is made par on par with that on the PlayStation 5. Ambient occlusion is also great for easy wins, where going down to high sees a 5% performance increase with slightly heavier AO darkening, and going down to medium sees a reduction in the amount of AO darkening, but an almost 9% increase in performance over Epic, and low is a bit faster than that but lacks noticeable AO. Here I recommend actually medium for my optimized settings on a mid-range GPU. Looking at PlayStation 5's quality level, it did not seem to align with high or ultra based upon the distribution of ambient occlusion over the face of the pillow here, but it was almost like a mix of a medium and low together. The model quality setting reduces the draw distance of geometry at a distance, and it is, in my opinion, not worth it to reduce its quality for optimized settings, as you will start seeing more obvious models draw close to the camera. Here I recommend Epic for optimized settings. Much the same there on PlayStation 5, as its level of detail for models lines up 1-to-1 with the Epic preset when we look at something like this vine here, which is present on the PlayStation 5 version and in the Epic model quality. Particle quality controls as it says, but it also importantly controls the render distance of the game's tall grass, which uses a particle system. Epic has the furthest distance as we're seeing here, but the highest costs, while high shows a noticeable decrease in the distance of particle grass, but a respectable 6% performance uplift. I recommend high for that reason. PlayStation 5, when put side by side with PC at the Epic particle setting, shows grass drawing in closer to the camera. So here we can see that the grass at a distance is there on PC, but it's not there on PlayStation 5. If we do exact lineups, we can see that it lines up perfectly with PC's high particle setting. This is another reason why I also recommend high here, is because the Epic setting shows a visual discrepancy that is not great. When set to Epic, some grass patches no longer gradually grow in as the camera approaches them, like we can see here on the high setting. The grass is slowly growing in as the camera approaches, minimizing its level of detail behavior. On the Epic particle settings, those further away grass patches just kind of pop in full on, instead of gradually growing as the camera approaches. I find this distracting when moving at full speed, so I recommend high for nearly everyone actually, even beyond optimized settings until this is fixed. Shadow quality follows the trend where high offers a substantial 6% performance uplift with a visible quality difference that is worth it, and then medium and low below that see less gains for more substantial hits to quality. Here I recommend the high quality setting for optimized settings, and looking at PS5 it's much the same there. If you look at the quality of the thin shadows like this one right here, you can see the amount of aliasing in there lines up with the high setting as found on PC for this shadow. Lighting quality controls the game's indirect lighting, and in my experience, offers mostly subtle changes in most areas of the game. Here, the performance and VRAM impact is so minimal that I recommend Epic for optimized settings. Based on the intensity of indirect specularity in certain scenes, I would hazard the guess that PlayStation 5 uses the Epic setting. Although, as you can see here, there's some light leak there on PlayStation 5, which I just could not find on PC, so it might be a little different in some way, but it basically looks like Epic. The last notable question of optimization is for texture quality, and I would say don't worry about it. When using an 8GB GPU at a reasonable resolution of 1440p, Epic settings did nothing to impact this game's performance in my measurements. VRAM was kept in check to healthy levels, as we're seeing here, and no dangerous limits were met. None of the usual DX12 low VRAM behavior occurred, like dramatic slowdowns to the frame rate. So I say use this one at Epic for modern GPUs with 8GB or more. Here, PS5 uses the Epic setting for texture quality when put side by side with the various presets on PC, although as I showed off earlier, the image quality treatment on PS5 does tend to make textures look noticeably degraded at a distance unless they're directly in front of the camera. Other things to watch out for in optimized settings are image quality related. For NVIDIA RTX users, definitely use DLSS, XeSS on Intel, but Radeon users lacking FSR2 here will have different choices. If you want to, you can try out a variable rate shading, which at its quality setting and its tier 2 implementation here offers a substantial 13% performance uplift in darker scenes with no visible quality loss to mention. It is usually quite awesome, but I say usually as here you can see in the background that there's almost a Z-flooding flicker that I've seen occasionally trigger when this is turned on. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. Another option is dynamic resolution, which works very well, but with a caveat. Check out this three-way bench. DRS is on the left with VSync on. The middle has DRS on with VSync off, and the right has DRS off with VSync on. Native resolution on the far right with VSync there is at 1440p native constantly. And for the RTX 2060 Super at my optimized settings, it will be often below 60 FPS in this benchmark when things are happening on screen. In the middle though, we can see DRS working its magic and incredibly well, where it's keeping the frame rate above 60, a healthy amount if you notice, and the percentage of resolution of 1440p to keep that frame rate up shows it dropping and raising that internal resolution to maintain image quality and a headroom on the GPU in case there are momentary spikes from effects. So DRS is working really well here, but it's only working with VSync off in the middle here. On the far left, VSync is on and DRS just flat out doesn't work, where it always goes down to the minimum resolution set for it. Here I set it to a 50% minimum. So DRS doesn't work with VSync on, or if you use any external capping of any sort, so keep that in mind. Maybe this can be patched to work with VSync, but at the moment use DRS if you have something like a VRR display. And there are your optimized settings. Reasonable drops to quality that can be a bit noticeable next to Epic, but the performance wins are significant. Not including ray tracing, you can see scenes like this one here where the optimized settings will perform around 14% better, and honestly, I think most of you out there will not notice those smaller quality differences. But what about optimized audio settings? Wait, what did I just say? Yeah, you heard me right. Returnal actually has audio quality settings, and look at that. Hardware ray traced audio that utilizes DXR on the GPU for potentially better audio physics than when done on the CPU. How does it sound? Let's do a test. Running from out in the rain into a cave with ray traced audio on the right here. Now with RT audio off on the left. Now with my hearing damage, I'm not the best person for this kind of a test, but I think I'm hearing more pronounced audio muffling in the cave with RT audio on, and perhaps a bit of a difference in the reverb too. Is it worth it for optimized settings? Honestly, to make a good decision about this, one would require an entire video in its own right to analyze what it is doing. Audio can be pretty subtle, but in the here and now, you can know that on an RTX 2060 Super at my optimized settings, it will lower performance consistently by about 4% when GPU limited, but the frame times were also technically less stable, as you can see on the frame time graph when it was on. I think this option is mega cool, and it is perhaps the first time we're seeing this in a game, which requires an immense amount of praise to the developers for getting it in there in the first place. But for the moment, if you are looking for the smoothest and potentially fastest experience, then you may want to leave this off, considering those frame times I just showed you there, or until there's a more thorough examination of it out there by an audio professional, which I am definitely not. And now is the point in the video where I get to the issues of the game, and of course I'm talking about #StutterStruggle. Now, as I said in the beginning of this video, I don't think the main cause of stutter in this game is from shader compilation. Rather, I think it's a similar issue to that which we saw on PlayStation 5. You traverse the game levels, and if you run around between loading areas, like doors, you will see a small hitch. It happens on PlayStation 5, and yes, it will happen on PC. Now, the intensity of that hitching is indeed a curious thing. If I run a high-end PC at my optimized settings, targeting 120 Hz like we're seeing here, just running around the game's first level, most of the hitches when traversing the game world with VSync on never go above 16.6 milliseconds. That means with a high-end CPU, without ray tracing on, your traversal hitches may almost never go above 16.6 milliseconds, which means if you lock the game at 60 FPS, you would rarely see a traversal hitch, as it would require the frame time to be greater than 16.6 milliseconds for a hitch to occur. What you should see here is that the game is indeed hitching, and I find this disappointing, but in its based mode without ray tracing on a high-end PC CPU, it's arguably better than what we saw on PlayStation 5. And it's very similar to other Unreal Engine 4 titles, which kind of also have this issue usually. But this is not the end of the stuttering issues in my experience. If you're on a mid-range CPU, utilizing my optimized settings like the Ryzen 5 3600 we're seeing here, and you run around the game world, you can see spikes on the frame time graph that are in excess of 50 milliseconds and are very noticeable and not good at all. They can get in the way of the game feeling fluid when running around, which this game desperately needs given the amount of backtracking you do and how slickly fast you move from arena to arena. Here's a good example of how it can manifest on a mid-range CPU. Just running around this empty arena here, we can see how at the middle point of the arena, there are some frame time spikes which you really shouldn't expect. I presume they have to do with loading of some sort, as they appear again and again when you return to the same area, something that shader compilation would not do. So there's a big compromise to frame time stability when on a mid-range CPU, even at optimized settings, and with ray tracing off. And I've even sometimes seen frame time weirdness on this mid-range CPU right as I enter a new arena and engage in a fight, as we're seeing here. In such a moment, I have a hard time knowing whether the thing causing these frame time spikes is me entering a new area and some loading occurring, or if there's something going on in the combat here which is causing frame time spikes. The point is, on a mid-range CPU, the game will feel stuttery in a way that is not found there on high-end CPUs. But that is not the end of the story. In my experience, when ray-traced reflections or shadows are on, and technically maybe even ray-traced audio, new stutters are brought into the game that just weren't there before. With ray tracing off on that high-end system I showed earlier, there were never frame time spikes above 33.3 milliseconds when running around the game world. With ray tracing on, as we're seeing here, I found a whole host of strange and unexpected frame times. Some felt like they could be related to me traversing the game world, while others almost coincided with game world events, but they mainly manifested much like the traversal stutters that I showed off earlier, except with ray tracing on, the frame time spike was much, much larger, as you're seeing here, and it led to a disruption of the gameplay, even on a high-end CPU like the Core i9-12900K, and occasionally it would also somehow enter into certain combats, manifesting at a moment when you really wouldn't expect it. The fact that it could happen in combat with ray tracing on, to me tells that most people should probably turn ray tracing off if they want to enjoy this game and not accidentally die because they had a stutter in the middle of combat. Usually I would try and deduce or guess as to why this is happening, but since I have such a good dialogue with the developers here, and I've been sharing my findings with them, I asked them and they told me that they believe the issue currently that people are seeing with ray tracing on with these stutters is due to geometry mesh creation and not as a result of shader compilation. And importantly, they are aiming to address this in a future patch. This is great to hear, but for the moment, I do recommend turning off ray tracing until such a patch arrives to avoid any stutter it may induce. In the end here, there's a lot to like about Returnal on PC. The settings are excellent and are only going to get better. The setting menu in itself just rocks. The benchmark is top tier and something other devs should emulate. When it is running full tick, it looks a lot better than PS5, and it plays sublimely at 120 FPS or higher. Seriously, 120 FPS just unleashes this game in a way that needs to be seen and felt. I honestly felt a little bit overpowered playing the game on PC. I did not even die during my gameplay run for the B-roll that I was gathering for this video here. And I made it all the way to the 3rd biome. I don't think I really could have done that with a controller on the PS5 version. But that was all on a high-end CPU with ray tracing purposefully turned off for the most time to avoid the stutters that are associated with it. And even not including that, there are traversal stutters when going around the game world and just opening doors and things. And on a low-end CPU, it's even worse, where stutters can sometimes even intrude in on gameplay. As a result of that behavior, I'd say if you're on a mid-range CPU, I would wait to play this game until patches can look into that stutter. If you're on a high-end CPU, I recommend playing the game now, just without ray tracing. That is a shame, but it will be patched up soon into a better state. And with that little bit being said, we've reached the end of this video. It sure was long. Still, if you like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to enable more PC-specific videos like this in the future. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.